Sheriff Billy Hutchinson's finger froze on the taser trigger, his weathered face locked in disbelief as the 9-year-old blind girl crumpled to the ground beside her German shepherd. The electricity had found them both. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to a child, not to Gracie McConnell. The crowd at Cedar Falls' annual Harvest Festival erupted into screams, cell phones clattering to the asphalt as horrified parents shielded their children's eyes. Duke's massive body convulsed once, then went terrifyingly still, his protective stance never wavering even as consciousness slipped away. Dorothy Patterson's knees buckled as she watched her granddaughter's small fingers desperately search the air for her beloved guide dog, those same fingers that had braided his fur just that morning. The smell of burnt ozone mixed with kettle corn and autumn leaves, a combination that would haunt this town forever. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. But Hutchinson stood frozen, the weight of 20 years in law enforcement crashing down around him. What had he done? And in front of everyone who mattered. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Cedar Falls, Iowa, had been nothing more than a dot on the highway map, the kind of place where strangers still waved and the Methodist church bells marked time better than any clock. Population 2,847, though that number kept shrinking as young folks headed to Des Moines or Chicago, leaving behind empty storefronts and fading dreams along Main Street. Dorothy Mae Patterson had lived through 72 winters in this town, watching it bloom and wither like the corn that surrounded it. Her arthritic hands still remembered the feel of fabric beneath her Singer sewing machine, back when she'd altered wedding dresses and hemmed school clothes for half the county. Those days were gone now, along with her husband Earl and their daughter Sarah, leaving Dot with Social Security checks that never quite stretched to cover the month, and a granddaughter who saw the world through fingertips and faith. Grace, Eleanor McConnell, Gracie, to everyone who mattered, had been born into darkness 3 years after the new millennium, her blue eyes as perfect and useless as painted glass. The doctors in Iowa City used words like congenital and irreversible, but Dot preferred simpler truths. God had given this child other gifts to make up for what he'd withheld. At 9 years old, Gracie could identify every bird in Cedar Falls by its song, play Amazing Grace on the church piano by memory, and navigate their small farmhouse with the confidence of someone who'd never needed sight to find her way home. Everything changed the day Duke arrived. The German shepherd had cost Dot every penny of her late husband's life insurance, $15,000 that might have fixed the leaking roof or replaced the ancient furnace. Instead, she'd driven 4 hours to the Canine Companion Center in Des Moines, watching Gracie's face transform as the massive dog gently placed his muzzle in her small palm. Duke had been trained for 3 years, the volunteers explained, though his past remained mysteriously sparse. He'd appeared at their facility 4 years earlier. No collar, no chip, just an uncanny intelligence and a desperate need to serve. "He's been waiting for her," the trainer had whispered to Dot, watching as Gracie's fingers explored Duke's ears with the reverence of a blind child discovering snow. "Some matches are made in heaven." The town hadn't embraced the partnership immediately. Sheriff Billy Hutchinson had been the loudest voice of concern, his 20-year law enforcement career having taught him that large dogs and small children made for dangerous combinations. His own divorce papers were still fresh when Duke arrived, the ink barely dry on documents that blamed his emotional unavailability for the collapse of his marriage. Hutchinson spent his evenings alone now, nursing bourbon and bitterness in equal measure, his badge the only thing left that defined him. But Gracie and Duke proved the skeptics wrong, one careful step at a time through Cedar Falls' tree-lined streets, their bond deeper than training, stronger than doubt. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late September when Gracie walked through the doors of Cedar Falls Elementary with Duke at her side, their synchronized steps echoing down the freshly waxed hallway. Principal Martha Hendricks had fought the school board for 3 months to make this moment possible, arguing that inclusion meant more than just good intentions. It meant changing how they saw children like Gracie. "Morning, sweetheart," Mrs. Hendricks called out, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her a fixture in Cedar Falls education for 37 years. Duke's ears perked at the familiar greeting, his tail offering a single dignified wag as Gracie navigated toward her third-grade classroom. But not everyone shared the principal's enthusiasm. By lunch, Hutchinson's office had received its first complaint, an anonymous voicemail claiming a dangerous animal was terrorizing children during recess. The caller's voice, high-pitched and deliberately disguised, painted a picture of chaos that bore no resemblance to reality. Duke had spent recess lying peacefully in the shade, allowing curious children to pet his silky coat while Gracie explained his job with the patience of a seasoned teacher. "That dog doesn't belong around our children," came another call that afternoon, this one from Beverly Kowalski, whose own grandson attended Cedar Falls Elementary. "What happens when it snaps? Who's responsible then?" Hutchinson listened to each message with growing unease, his memories drifting to a call 15 years earlier, a rabid shepherd that had cornered a toddler in Marshalltown. He'd been forced to shoot that dog, watching the light fade from its eyes while the child's mother screamed in the background. The image still visited his dreams on bad nights, usually accompanied by bourbon. 2 weeks later, Duke proved his worth in a way that silenced most critics. The old boiler in the school's basement had been leaking natural gas for hours, filling the building with invisible danger. While teachers conducted their afternoon lessons, oblivious to the threat below, Duke began to pace restlessly in Gracie's classroom. His whining grew insistent, then urgent, as his nose detected what human senses couldn't. "Duke, what's wrong?" Gracie whispered, feeling the tension in his harness as he pulled toward the door. Mrs. Henderson noticed the disruption and was about to intervene when Duke did something unprecedented. He barked. Once, sharp and commanding, breaking every rule of his careful training. The evacuation happened quickly after that. Fire Chief Robert Manning arrived to find gas levels that could have leveled half the building. "That dog saved every life in this school," he announced to the crowd of parents gathered on the playground. No question about it. The story made the front page of the Cedar Falls Gazette, complete with a photo of Duke sitting patiently beside Gracie while she received a citizenship award from Mayor Patricia Collins. For a brief moment, it seemed the controversy might finally be over, but Hutchinson's prejudice ran deeper than logic. 3 days after Duke's heroics, he appeared at the school for what he called a wellness check. His uniform crisp and his jaw set with the determination of a man convinced he was protecting the innocent. He found Dot in the hallway, adjusting Gracie's backpack before afternoon dismissal. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years behind a badge. "I need to speak with you about that animal." Dot straightened to her full 5'4" height, her eyes flashing with protective fire. "That animal has a name, Sheriff. It's Duke. And he's my granddaughter's eyes." "I don't care what you call it," Hutchinson replied, stepping closer in a way meant to intimidate. "Large dogs are unpredictable. I've seen what they can do when they turn, and I won't have children at risk on my watch." The confrontation drew a small crowd. Teachers emerging from classrooms, parents lingering in the hallway. Gracie appeared at Dot's side, Duke maintaining his perfect position despite the tension crackling through the air. "Duke would never hurt anyone," Gracie said, her young voice steady despite her nervousness. "He's my best friend. He saved everyone in this school. Hutchinson's gaze fell on the child, something flickering across his features too quickly to interpret. "Good intentions don't prevent accidents, little girl. And when that dog hurts someone, not if when, the blood will be on your grandmother's hands." The words hung in the air like a curse, their cruelty echoing off the tile walls. Dot felt her chest tighten, the weight of financial worry and social pressure suddenly overwhelming. Behind them, Duke remained motionless, his training holding firm even as his human family faced attack. "We have every right to be here," Dot said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gracie deserves the same education as any other child in this town." Hutchinson touched his badge, a gesture both unconscious and threatening. "Rights don't mean much when children get hurt, Mrs. Patterson. Remember that." The call came in on a Thursday afternoon in early October, just as the maple trees were beginning their autumn transformation. Hutchinson was nursing his second cup of coffee when dispatch crackled to life. "Sheriff, we've got a report of a dog attack at Riverside Park. Caller says a German shepherd bit an 8-year-old boy." Hutchinson's blood ran cold. He'd been waiting for this call, dreading it, yet somehow expecting it with the grim certainty of a man who'd seen too much go wrong in his career. "I'm en route," he radioed back, already reaching for his keys. At Riverside Park, he found Tommy Brennan sitting on a picnic table while his mother, Jessica, examined fresh scratches on his forearm. The boy's eyes were wide with what looked like fear, though something about his expression nagged at Hutchinson, a calculation that seemed too mature for 8 years old. "It was that blind girl's dog," Tommy said before anyone asked. "Duke. He came at me while I was on the swings. Look what he did to my arm." Jessica Brennan, recently divorced and struggling to manage 2 jobs while raising Tommy alone, wrapped her son in a fierce embrace. "I knew this would happen," she declared to the small crowd that had gathered. "Everyone said that dog was dangerous, but nobody listened." Hutchinson examined the scratches, 3 parallel lines that broke the skin but weren't deep enough to require stitches. They looked consistent with a dog's claws, though something about their placement bothered him. Still, the evidence was there, and the boy's story was clear. More importantly, it confirmed everything Hutchinson had been warning the town about for months. By evening, the story had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Social media posts multiplied faster than autumn leaves, each retelling adding new details, magnifying the threat. "Dangerous Dog Attacks Child," screamed the headline on the Cedar Falls community Facebook page, garnering 57 comments within the first hour. The emergency town hall meeting was called for the following Tuesday, held in the basement of Cedar Falls Methodist Church, where the community had gathered for everything from wedding receptions to funeral luncheons. Pastor Robert Manning opened with a prayer for wisdom, but the tension in the room suggested divine intervention might not be enough. The basement was packed beyond capacity, folding chairs arranged in hasty rows while overflow crowds stood along the walls. Hutchinson sat in the front row beside Mayor Patricia Collins, his uniform pressed and his expression grave. Behind him, the town had divided itself into visible camps, those who believed Duke was dangerous and those who'd witnessed his gentle nature firsthand. Dot arrived with Gracie and Duke just before 7 o'clock, their entrance causing a ripple of whispers throughout the room. Duke wore his official service vest, his posture alert but calm despite the hostile energy surrounding them. Gracie's small hand rested on his harness, her chin lifted with a dignity that broke hearts and strengthened resolve in equal measure. Mayor Collins called for order, her voice struggling to carry over the murmur of conversation. "We're here tonight to discuss concerns that have been raised about a service animal attending our local school. I want everyone to remember that we're neighbors here, and we need to treat each other with respect." Jessica Brennan stood first, her voice shaking with maternal fury. "Respect? Where was the respect for my son's safety when that dog attacked him?" Tommy could have been killed and we're supposed to sit here and pretend everything's fine? The crowd erupted into competing voices, some calling for Duke's removal, others defending his right to be there. Dr. Samuel Pierce, the town's retired veterinarian, rose slowly from his chair near the back. "I've been working with animals for 43 years, he said, his weathered voice carrying the authority of experience. "I've seen truly dangerous dogs, and I've seen scared children make up stories. What I witnessed at that park wasn't an attack. It was a boy who fell off his swing and a dog who tried to help." "You calling my son a liar?" Jessica shot back, her face flushing red. Before Dr. Pierce could answer, Principal Hendricks stood with a manila folder in her hands. "I have something everyone needs to see," she announced, moving toward the front of the room. "The park installed security cameras last month. We have footage of what really happened that afternoon." The room fell silent as Hendricks set up a small laptop, connecting it to the church's aging projector. The image was grainy, but clear enough. Tommy Brennan on the swings, alone in the late afternoon sun. Duke appeared at the edge of the frame, walking calmly with Gracie toward the playground equipment. What happened next lasted only seconds, but changed everything. Tommy jumped from the swing at the peak of its arc, a move any parent would recognize as dangerous. He landed hard, crying out as he scraped his arm against the metal chain. Duke immediately moved toward the sound of distress, his training compelling him to investigate and assist. The scratches on Tommy's arm came from the swing's chain, not Duke's claws. The dog had been trying to comfort a hurt child, not attack him. Tommy Brennan began to cry, not the angry tears of a victim, but the guilty sobs of a child whose lie had spiraled beyond his control. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely audible in the suddenly quiet room. "Mom and Dad are getting divorced, and I thought if something bad happened, maybe they'd come back together to take care of me." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Jessica Brennan's face went white as she pulled her son close, understanding flooding her features. Across the room, Hutchinson felt his carefully constructed case crumbling, yet instead of relief, he experienced something closer to panic. Dot Patterson stood slowly, her 72-year-old frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. "In all my years," she said, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through loss, "I've learned that fear makes good people do terrible things. But I've also learned that love, real love, can heal wounds we didn't even know we had." She looked directly at Hutchinson, her eyes holding no anger, only profound sadness. "Duke isn't just my granddaughter's eyes, Sheriff. He's her heart, her confidence, her bridge to a world that doesn't always understand her. Don't take away the only family I have left." The vote, when it came, was closer than expected. 47 in favor of allowing Duke to remain in school, 33 opposed. But Hutchinson knew the real damage had been done, not to his case, but to his soul. The weeks following the town hall meeting settled into an uneasy peace, like the calm before a summer storm that everyone could feel building in the distance. Duke continued his daily routine with Gracie, guiding her through Cedar Falls Elementary's hallways with the same quiet dignity he'd always shown, but the atmosphere around them had changed. Conversations stopped when they passed, replaced by whispered discussions and sideways glances that Gracie couldn't see but certainly felt. Dot noticed the change most acutely in the small cruelties that began to accumulate like autumn leaves. The grocery store clerk who suddenly couldn't make eye contact, the neighbor who no longer waved from her porch, the anonymous note slipped under their door reading, "That dog doesn't belong here." Each incident was small enough to ignore individually, but together they formed a pattern of isolation that pressed down on their small family, like a weight. The financial pressure had been building for months, though Dot had tried to shield Gracie from the worst of it. The property tax bill that arrived in late October carried a number that made her hands shake, $3,247, due by January 1st, or face foreclosure proceedings. Earl's pension had stopped with his death, leaving only Social Security and the meager income from alterations she could still manage with her arthritic fingers. The mathematics were brutal and simple. There wasn't enough money. She'd already sold Earl's vintage Ford pickup to a collector in Des Moines, watching 40 years of memories drive away for $1,800 that barely covered Duke's training fees and veterinary care. The wedding ring she'd worn for 51 years sat in a pawn shop downtown, though she told Gracie it was being cleaned. Every sacrifice felt like losing another piece of the life she'd built with Earl. But losing Gracie would be unthinkable. Duke's poisoning happened on a Wednesday night in early November. Dot found him in the backyard the next morning, retching violently beside the old oak tree where Earl used to hang a tire swing for their daughter Sarah. The veterinary emergency clinic in Des Moines confirmed what Dr. Pierce suspected. Someone had mixed antifreeze into raw hamburger and thrown it over their fence. Duke's kidneys were damaged, but not beyond repair, though the treatment would cost another $1,200 they didn't have. "Who would do such a thing?" Gracie asked, her small hands trembling as she sat beside Duke's kennel at the clinic. The German Shepherd was conscious but weak, his usually bright eyes dulled with pain and medication. "Duke never hurt anyone. He saves people." Dot had no answer that wouldn't terrify a 9-year-old child. The truth was that fear had a way of making neighbors into strangers, turning community into something fractured and dangerous. She'd seen it before during the farm crisis of the 1980s, when desperation turned friend against friend over land and debt and survival. The anonymous donations began appearing shortly after Duke's poisoning made the rounds of Cedar Falls gossip. $5 tucked into Dot's mailbox with a note reading, "For Duke's medical bills." $20 left on their porch with, "From a friend," written in careful script. Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski, the same woman who'd initially opposed Duke's presence at school, organized a quiet fundraising effort through the Methodist Ladies' Circle, collecting grocery store gift cards and cash contributions without fanfare or publicity. "People are basically good," Pastor Manning told Dot when she tried to thank him for the congregation's support. "Sometimes they just need reminding of who they really are underneath the fear." But for every gesture of kindness, there seemed to be a corresponding cruelty. Duke's food bowls were stolen from their front porch. Someone spray-painted "Dangerous Dog" on their mailbox in red letters that looked like blood in the early morning light. Worst of all were the phone calls that came at night. Heavy breathing, muffled threats, the sound of someone's hatred given voice in the darkness. Gracie's nightmares began around this time. Terrible dreams where Duke disappeared into shadows she couldn't follow. She'd wake calling his name, her small body shaking with the fear that had finally penetrated her remarkable resilience. Duke would appear beside her bed within seconds, pressing his warm flank against her hand until her breathing calmed and sleep returned. Hutchinson's drinking had escalated since the town hall meeting, his evening bourbon session stretching later into the night as he wrestled with emotions he couldn't name. His ex-wife Linda had taken their daughter Melissa to her sister's place in Minnesota, claiming she needed space to figure things out. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but Hutchinson knew the real reason. He'd become someone Linda couldn't recognize, someone consumed by anger and suspicion that poisoned everything he touched. The sheriff's department was feeling the strain as well. Deputy Marcus Thompson, a decent man with 2 young children of his own, had begun questioning orders that seemed more about personal vendetta than public safety. When Hutchinson insisted on driving past the Patterson house 3 times during each shift, ostensibly for wellness checks, Thompson's discomfort was visible. "Sheriff," Thompson said carefully one afternoon as they sat in the patrol car outside Cedar Falls Elementary, "maybe we should consider that the dog situation has been resolved." The boy admitted he lied. The video showed what really happened. Folks are starting to ask questions about our priorities. Hutchinson's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he watched Duke guide Gracie down the school's front steps. Large dogs are unpredictable, Deputy. One good day doesn't erase the potential for disaster. When that animal hurts someone, and it will, the blood will be on our hands if we didn't take appropriate precautions. But Thompson wasn't convinced, and neither were an increasing number of townspeople who'd begun to see Hutchinson's campaign against Duke as something personal rather than professional. The whispered conversations in Mabel's diner and Kowalski's hardware store were beginning to turn, not just in favor of Duke, but against a sheriff who seemed to have lost his way. The letter from the University of Iowa Medical Center arrived on a gray November morning that smelled of snow and dying leaves. Dot's hands shook as she read about an experimental surgical procedure that could potentially restore partial vision to patients with Gracie's specific condition. The success rate was promising. Nearly 60% of patients experienced significant improvement, but the cost was staggering. $200,000, with most insurance companies still considering it investigational. "What does it say, Grandma Dot?" Gracie asked, sensing the change in atmosphere from where she sat at the kitchen table, helping Duke with his breakfast routine that had become their shared morning ritual. Dot folded the letter carefully, buying time to compose her voice. "It's about a new kind of doctor in Iowa City, sweetheart. Someone who might be able to help you see." The hope that blazed across Gracie's face was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Really? I could see Duke's face, and yours, and the colors everyone talks about?" "Maybe," Dot said carefully. "But it's very expensive, and we'd need to learn more about whether it would work for you specifically." That night, after Gracie had fallen asleep with Duke stretched protectively across the foot of her bed, Dot sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills. Even selling the house wouldn't generate enough money for the surgery, and at 72, she had no hope of qualifying for a loan of that magnitude. The mathematics of desperation had no solutions, only the cruel arithmetic of impossible choices. The mysterious benefactor's offer arrived 3 days later, delivered by a lawyer from Des Moines whose expensive suit looked out of place in their modest farmhouse living room. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. A charitable foundation would cover the full cost of Gracie's surgery, including all follow-up care and rehabilitation. The only condition was that Duke would need to be relocated to a more appropriate environment for safety reasons. The Foundation's board believes that service animals, while admirable, can present unnecessary risks during the recovery period from such delicate surgery, the lawyer explained in the careful language of legal liability. They're prepared to help Miss McConnell transition to other mobility aids that would be more suitable for her new circumstances. Dot stared at the papers spread across her coffee table, contracts that could give Gracie sight, but would take away her heart. The cruelty of the choice was breathtaking in its completeness, forcing her to choose between her granddaughter's future and her happiness. "I need time to think," Dot said finally. "Of course," the lawyer replied, gathering his papers with practiced efficiency. "But I should mention that this type of surgical intervention is time-sensitive. The longer we wait, the less likely the procedure is to succeed. Miss McConnell's young age is currently in her favor, but that advantage diminishes with each passing month." After he left, Dot sat alone in her living room as shadows lengthened across the worn carpet. From upstairs came the sound of Gracie practicing piano, her small fingers finding melodies that Duke seemed to appreciate, judging by his contented sighs. It was a sound that had filled their house with joy for 3 years, but now it seemed tinged with the possibility of loss. That evening, as they sat down for dinner at the kitchen table that had served 3 generations of Patterson family meals, Gracie made an announcement that shattered what remained of Dot's composure. "Grandma Dot," she said, her voice carrying the serious tone she used for important conversations, "I heard you talking to that man today about my eyes. If seeing again means losing Duke, then I don't want to see. I'd rather stay blind than lose my best friend." The words hung in the air between them, a 9-year-old's wisdom cutting through the complexity of adult choices to reach the simple truth underneath. Love, Gracie was saying, mattered more than sight. Family meant more than cure. Dot reached across the table to take her granddaughter's hand, feeling the strength in those small fingers that had learned to read the world through touch. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking on words that couldn't possibly contain the fullness of her love and pride and heartbreak. Under the table, Duke pressed his warm body against Gracie's leg, a comforting presence, who understood that his human was struggling with something beyond his ability to fix. His devotion was absolute and uncomplicated, a constancy that had become the foundation upon which their small family was built. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting Cedar Falls in white that would soon cover the divisions and hatred and fear that had taken root in their community. But inside the Patterson farmhouse, 3 hearts beat in rhythm with the understanding that some bonds transcended every obstacle except the cruelty of impossible choices. The morning of Cedar Falls' annual Harvest Festival dawned crisp and golden, with the kind of October sunshine that made the cornfields glow like burnished copper, and reminded everyone why they'd chosen to build their lives in this particular corner of Iowa. Main Street had been transformed overnight, strung with orange and red bunting that fluttered in the gentle breeze, while the scent of kettle corn and apple cider drifted from booths that lined both sides of the street. Dot helped Gracie into her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers that Earl had always said matched her eyes, while Duke waited patiently beside the bed, his service vest freshly brushed and gleaming. The German shepherd seemed to sense the importance of the day, his posture more alert than usual as he watched the preparations. Today marked Gracie's first public performance since the controversy began, a chance to remind the community of who she really was beneath all the fear and politics. "You nervous, sweetheart?" Dot asked, adjusting the ribbon in Gracie's blonde hair for the 3rd time. Her own hands were trembling slightly, though whether from arthritis or anxiety she couldn't say. "A little," Gracie admitted, reaching down to stroke Duke's ears in the gesture that always calmed them both. "But Duke says everything will be fine. He's never wrong about important things." The talent show was scheduled for 2 o'clock on the makeshift stage erected in front of the Methodist Church, giving families time to wander through the craft booths and sample the homemade goods that had been Cedar Falls' tradition for over 60 years. Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski had outdone herself with apple butter, while the volunteer fire department grilled bratwurst with the enthusiasm of men who took their community service seriously. Sheriff Hutchinson arrived early, parking his patrol car at the edge of Main Street where he could observe the festivities while remaining somewhat apart from them. He'd been drinking since breakfast. Not enough to impair his duties, he told himself, just enough to quiet the voices in his head that whispered increasingly uncomfortable truths about his motivations. His ex-wife Linda had called that morning to inform him that she was filing for permanent custody of their daughter Melissa, citing his deteriorating mental state as grounds for concern. "You've become someone I don't recognize, Billy," she'd said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd tried too long to save a drowning man. "Melissa is afraid of you now. She flinches when you raise your voice, and that's not the father she remembers." The words had hit him harder than he'd expected, confirming fears he'd been pushing down with increasingly frequent applications of bourbon. He'd joined law enforcement to protect people, to be the kind of man a community could respect and children could look up to. Somewhere along the way, he'd become something else entirely. The festival crowd had swelled to over 500 people by noon, with visitors from neighboring towns drawn by the promise of good food and small-town charm. News crews from Des Moines and Cedar Rapids had set up cameras near the stage, their presence a reminder that Cedar Falls had become something of a curiosity in the regional media, the small town divided over a blind girl and her dog. Deputy Marcus Thompson moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his uniform crisp and his demeanor friendly as he chatted with families and helped elderly residents navigate the street vendors. He'd grown up in Cedar Falls, married his high school sweetheart here, and raised his own children in the same neighborhood where he learned to ride a bicycle. The town's recent divisions troubled him deeply, particularly his sheriff's increasingly erratic behavior. "Sheriff," Thompson said, approaching Hutchinson's position beside the patrol car, "everything looks peaceful so far. Good turnout for the talent show." Hutchinson's gaze was fixed on the stage where volunteers were testing the sound system, his jaw tight with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. "Large crowds mean more potential for problems, Deputy. We need to stay alert." "Yes, sir," Thompson replied carefully, though his own assessment suggested nothing more threatening than a few teenagers testing the boundaries of parental supervision and some good-natured competition over whose chili recipe deserved the blue ribbon. At 1:30, Gracie and Duke took their position behind the makeshift backstage area, really just a large tent borrowed from the Lutheran church, while Dot found a seat in the front row reserved for performers' families. The other acts included everything from the Henderson twins' violin duet to Mayor Collins' grandson performing magic tricks with the earnestness that only an 8-year-old could muster. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Pastor Manning from the stage, his voice carrying easily over the crowd through the borrowed sound system, "welcome to our annual talent showcase, where the real talent of Cedar Falls gets to shine. Our first performer today is a young lady who's shown us all what courage looks like." Gracie emerged from the tent with Duke at her side, their synchronized movement drawing appreciative murmurs from the crowd. She wore her best dress and a smile that seemed to light up the entire festival, while Duke maintained his perfect service dog demeanor, despite the chaos of scents and sounds surrounding them. "Hi, everyone," Gracie said into the microphone, her voice clear and confident despite her nervousness. "My name is Gracie McConnell, and this is my best friend Duke. We're going to sing Amazing Grace for you today because it's my grandma's favorite song, and because sometimes we all need to remember that amazing things can happen when we believe in them." The opening notes came from her throat like liquid gold, a pure soprano that seemed impossible from someone so young. Duke sat perfectly still beside her, his intelligent eyes scanning the crowd with the vigilance that never left him, even in moments of beauty. Gracie's voice soared over the festival grounds, carrying words of redemption and hope that had comforted generations before her. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. The irony of those particular lyrics, sung by a blind child whose sight might never return, was lost on no one in the crowd. Tears appeared on faces throughout the audience, tough farmers who'd weathered decades of hardship, mothers who understood the fierce love that drove Dot Patterson's sacrifices, children who recognized something pure and true in Gracie's voice. Even Hutchinson felt something stir in his chest, a memory of the man he'd been before cynicism and fear had hardened his heart. For a moment, watching this small girl and her devoted companion, he almost remembered why he'd wanted to protect and serve in the first place. The song ended to thunderous applause, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever as the crowd expressed not just appreciation for Gracie's talent, but their love for a child who'd reminded them of their better angels. Gracie curtsied gracefully while Duke remained at perfect attention, his tail offering the slightest wag, the only sign of his own pleasure at his human's success. "Thank you," Gracie said into the microphone, her voice glowing with happiness. "Thank you for letting me and Duke be part of your community. We love Cedar Falls and we love all of you." It was then that Hutchinson's radio crackled to life with the call that would change everything. The voice was disguised, obviously altered by some electronic means, but the words were clear enough. "Sheriff, there's a dog attack in progress at the festival. German Shepherd has a child cornered near the stage. Multiple witnesses report aggressive behavior." Hutchinson's training took over, muscle memory from 2 decades of emergency responses. He was moving before he'd fully processed the information, his hand already reaching for the taser on his belt as he pushed through the crowd toward the stage area. The bourbon in his system mixed with adrenaline and old trauma, creating a perfect storm of impaired judgment and paranoid certainty. "Sheriff!" Deputy Thompson called out, jogging to catch up. "What's the situation?" "Dog attack," Hutchinson replied tersely, his eyes scanning the crowd for signs of panic that weren't there. "German Shepherd. Probably the same one that bit the Brennan boy." Thompson looked around in confusion, seeing nothing but families enjoying the lingering aftermath of Gracie's performance. Children were laughing, parents were chatting, vendors were calling out their wares. "Sir, I don't see any disturbance. Everything looks normal." But Hutchinson's vision had narrowed to a tunnel, his perception filtered through years of accumulated fear and resentment. When he spotted Duke beside the stage, still in his perfect service position while Gracie accepted congratulations from other performers, his mind supplied the threat his emotions needed to justify the action his hands were already preparing to take. "There," he said, pointing at Duke with a hand that trembled slightly. "The German Shepherd. I can see the aggressive posture from here." Thompson followed his sheriff's gaze and saw only what everyone else saw, a well-trained service dog maintaining his protective stance while his young handler enjoyed her moment of triumph. "Sheriff, that's just the blind girl's guide dog. He's not showing any signs of aggression." But Hutchinson was already moving, his weapon drawn, his mind locked into a pattern of response that had been building for months. Behind him, Thompson spoke urgently into his radio, calling for backup that would arrive too late to prevent what was about to happen. The crowd began to notice the approaching officer, conversations faltering as people realized something was wrong. Dot rose from her chair in the front row, her face pale with sudden understanding. Pastor Manning stepped protectively closer to the microphone, while other performers began moving away from the stage area. "Everyone step back," Hutchinson shouted, his voice carrying the authority of his badge and the barely controlled panic of a man whose demons had finally overtaken his judgment. "I need everyone to clear the area immediately." Gracie turned toward the sound of his voice, her face confused and frightened by the sudden change in atmosphere. Duke immediately pressed closer to her side, his training compelling him to position himself between his charge and any perceived threat. "Duke, what's happening?" Gracie whispered, her small hand tightening on his harness as she felt the tension in his body. The German Shepherd's instincts were screaming warnings, but his training held firm. He would not abandon his post, would not leave Gracie vulnerable, no matter what approached them. His love for this child transcended every other consideration, including his own safety. Hutchinson raised his taser, his finger finding the trigger as 20 years of service collapsed into this single moment of reckoning. The crowd held its breath. Cell phones rose to capture what was about to unfold, and in the terrible silence that preceded violence, the only sound was Gracie's confused voice calling Duke's name. Time suspended itself, balanced on the edge of irreversible action, while an entire community watched their sheriff prepare to destroy the thing a little blind girl loved most in the world. The taser's electrical discharge crackled through the autumn air with a sound like breaking lightning, 50,000 volts finding their target with merciless precision. Duke's massive body convulsed once, his muscles seizing as the electricity coursed through him. But even as consciousness began to slip away, his final act was one of perfect devotion, positioning himself between the threat and his beloved Gracie. The second discharge came as Gracie reached for her fallen companion, her small hands searching desperately for the warm fur that had been her constant comfort for 3 years. The electricity meant for a dangerous animal found instead a 9-year-old blind girl whose only crime had been loving unconditionally. Gracie's scream pierced the festival air, a sound of pure anguish that would haunt the dreams of everyone who heard it. She crumpled beside Duke's motionless form, her small body shaking from the electrical shock and the devastating realization that something terrible had happened to her best friend. The festival crowd erupted into chaos. Cell phones emerged like weapons, capturing every horrifying second as parents shielded their children's eyes and voices rose in disbelief and fury. "He shot a child!" someone screamed. "He shot a blind child and her dog!" Dot's knees buckled as she watched her granddaughter convulse on the ground, her arthritic hands clawing at the festival barricade that separated her from the stage. "Gracie!" she cried, her voice breaking on the name that had become the center of her world. "My baby girl!" Deputy Thompson reached the scene first, dropping to his knees beside Gracie while shouting into his radio for emergency medical services. The little girl was conscious but disoriented, her unseeing eyes wide with terror as she called Duke's name over and over. Her small hands patted the ground frantically, seeking the familiar comfort of her companion's fur. "Duke," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Duke, please wake up. Please don't leave me in the dark." The German shepherd lay terrifyingly still, his breathing shallow and irregular. The electrical shock had disrupted his heart rhythm, and foam appeared at the corners of his mouth as his body struggled to recover from the trauma. Dr. Samuel Pierce, the retired veterinarian, pushed through the crowd with the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out. "Get back, everyone!" Dr. Pierce commanded, kneeling beside Duke's prone form. His experienced hands found a weak pulse, irregular and thready. "This dog needs emergency veterinary care immediately, or we're going to lose him." Sheriff Hutchinson stood frozen, the spent taser hanging from his nerveless fingers as the magnitude of what he'd done crashed over him like a tsunami. The bourbon that had seemed to steady his nerves now betrayed him, making his vision swim as he watched a child sob over her dying companion. This wasn't what he'd intended. This wasn't who he'd meant to be. "What have you done?" Pastor Manning's voice carried the righteous anger of a man witnessing profound injustice. "That child never hurt anyone. That dog never hurt anyone. What in God's name have you done?" The crowd's mood was turning dangerous, their shock transforming into rage as they processed what they'd witnessed. Voices rose calling for Hutchinson's badge, his arrest, his removal from a community he'd sworn to protect. Deputy Thompson found himself in the impossible position of protecting his sheriff from the very people they both served. "Everyone needs to step back," Thompson announced. Though his own voice lacked conviction, he'd watched the entire incident unfold, had seen no threat that justified such extreme force. The radio calls he'd heard, the reports of aggressive behavior, none of it matched what his own eyes had witnessed. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The ambulance crew would arrive to find a traumatized child and a dying dog, the victims of a law enforcement action that defied all reason and training. The paramedics' faces would reflect the same confusion and horror that rippled through the crowd. How did a Harvest Festival talent show become the scene of such senseless violence? Gracie's small hand finally found Duke's ear, the familiar softness that had comforted her through countless nights and fears. "I'm here, Duke," she whispered, stroking the silky fur with trembling fingers. "I'm right here. You saved me again, didn't you? You always save me." Dot finally broke through the crowd, dropping to her knees beside her granddaughter with a desperate urgency that ignored her own arthritis and age. "Gracie, sweetheart, are you hurt?" "Tell Grandma where it hurts." "Duke won't wake up," Gracie said, her voice small and lost in a way that broke hearts throughout the crowd. "I keep calling his name, but he won't wake up. He always comes when I call." The ambulance crew worked with professional efficiency, checking Gracie's vital signs while Dr. Pierce continued his emergency assessment of Duke. The dog's condition was critical. The electrical shock had thrown his heart into an irregular rhythm that could prove fatal without immediate intervention. The nearest veterinary emergency clinic was 40 minutes away, time they might not have. "His heart is in arrhythmia," Dr. Pierce announced grimly, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience with animal trauma. "Without specialized cardiac equipment, I can't stabilize him here. He needs to get to the emergency clinic immediately." "I'll drive," offered Jim Kowalski, whose pickup truck was parked just off Main Street. "I can have you there in 30 minutes. As they carefully loaded Duke's unconscious form into the truck bed, Gracie fought to stay with him, her small hands clinging to his fur as if her touch alone could call him back from wherever the electricity had sent him. "Please don't take him away from me," she begged. "He's scared when I'm not there. He needs me." The sight of a blind child being separated from her service dog while both fought for recovery created images that would be broadcast nationwide within hours. Social media exploded with outrage and disbelief as festival attendees shared video footage of the incident. Justice for Duke and #SaveGracie began trending as the story spread beyond the borders of Cedar Falls, transforming a small town's tragedy into a national conversation about police accountability and the rights of disabled children. Sheriff Hutchinson remained at the scene as the ambulance departed with Gracie and the truck raced away with Duke, his face pale and his hands shaking as the reality of his actions sank in. The crowd had thinned, but not dispersed, their angry murmurs following him as he walked back toward his patrol car with the mechanical movements of a man in shock. "Billy Hutchinson, you're a disgrace to that badge," called out Mrs. Martha Hendricks, the school principal whose usually gentle demeanor had transformed into righteous fury. "That little girl trusted us to protect her, and you attacked her like she was a criminal." Deputy Thompson approached his sheriff with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Sheriff, maybe you should let me drive you home. The state police will want to interview you about the incident, and you'll want to be ready for that." Hutchinson looked at his deputy with eyes that seemed to see nothing, his mind struggling to process the gap between his perception of events and the reality that surrounded him. "There was a report of an attack," he said weakly. "A German shepherd attacking a child. I was responding to a call." "Sir," Thompson said gently, "there was no attack. That dog was just standing beside the little girl after her performance. He wasn't showing any signs of aggression. Everyone saw it." The words hit Hutchinson like physical blows, each one chipping away at the justifications he'd built to support his action. He thought of his ex-wife's words that morning, her concerns about his deteriorating judgment. He thought of his daughter, Melissa, who would learn from news reports that her father had tasered a blind child and her service dog at a community festival. As the patrol car pulled away from Main Street, Hutchinson caught a glimpse of the festival grounds in his mirror, abandoned booths, scattered programs, and the lingering evidence of a celebration turned nightmare. The stage where Gracie had sung Amazing Grace just an hour earlier now stood empty, its microphone swaying slightly in the autumn breeze like a memorial to innocence lost. Behind them, The community of Cedar Falls began the painful process of reckoning with what had happened in their midst, their anger and shame mixing with desperate prayers for a little blind girl and her beloved dog who had done nothing more than share their gifts with neighbors who had suddenly become strangers. The emergency veterinary clinic in Des Moines hummed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday evening, but the arrival of Duke's unconscious form brought a gravity that silenced even the most routine activities. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the clinic's cardiac specialist, had been following the story on social media during her dinner break when Jim Kowalski's truck pulled into the emergency bay with its precious cargo. Electrical shock trauma approximately 90 minutes ago, Dr. Pierce reported as they transferred Duke onto the examination table. Heart arrhythmia, respiratory depression, unresponsive to verbal stimuli. The dog was protecting a blind child when he was tased. Dr. Martinez's examination confirmed their worst fears. Duke's heart had sustained significant trauma from the electrical discharge, the muscle tissue showing signs of damage that could prove irreversible. His breathing was labored, his pulse weak and irregular, and the monitors tracking his vital signs painted a picture of a body fighting a battle it might not win. "We need to get him on cardiac support immediately," Dr. Martinez announced to her team. "Prep for emergency intervention and get me a full cardiac workup. How quickly can we get the child here? Sometimes animals in this condition respond better when their primary handler is present." At Cedar Falls Community Hospital, Gracie lay in a pediatric bed that seemed enormous around her small frame, electrodes monitoring her own heart rhythm while doctors assessed the effects of the electrical shock. The physical damage was minimal, some muscle soreness and temporary disorientation, but the psychological trauma was profound. She hadn't spoken since arriving at the hospital, her unseeing eyes staring toward the ceiling while tears tracked silently down her cheeks. Dot sat beside the bed holding her granddaughter's hand, her own heart breaking as she watched the light fade from a child who had faced blindness with such courage. "Duke is getting the best care possible, sweetheart," she whispered, though her own voice lacked conviction. "Dr. Pierce is with him, and he's the finest veterinarian in the state." "Duke tried to save me," Gracie finally whispered, her voice so quiet Dot had to lean close to hear. "He put himself between me and the bad man. He always protects me, even when it hurts him." The words carried a wisdom that seemed impossible from a 9-year-old, yet Gracie had learned lessons about loyalty and sacrifice that many adults never understood. Her bond with Duke transcended the typical relationship between human and animal. It was a partnership forged in mutual dependence and deepened by unconditional love. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hutchinson sat in his empty house, surrounded by the debris of a life that had slowly imploded over the past year. Empty bourbon bottles lined the kitchen counter like monuments to poor decisions, while divorce papers and custody documents created a paper trail of failures that led directly to this moment. His service weapon lay on the coffee table beside his badge, both symbols of authority that now felt like accusations. The national media attention had begun within hours of the incident, news crews arriving in Cedar Falls like vultures drawn to tragedy. CNN, Fox News, NBC, they all wanted to tell the story of the small-town sheriff who had attacked a blind child and her service dog at a community festival. Hutchinson's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, producers, and lawyers, each seeking their piece of a narrative that painted him as either a villain or a victim, depending on their particular agenda. But it was the call from his daughter Melissa that finally broke his remaining composure. The 8-year-old's voice carried confusion and hurt that cut deeper than any professional consequence could reach. "Daddy," she said, her words trembling across the distance between Minnesota and Iowa. "Mommy says you hurt a little girl and her dog. She says it's on the news everywhere. Why would you hurt a little girl, Daddy?" Hutchinson tried to find words that could explain the unexplainable, justify the unjustifiable. But the bourbon and grief and shame had stolen his ability to lie even to himself. "I made a terrible mistake, Princess," he whispered into the phone. "Daddy made a very bad choice, and now some good people are hurt because of it." "Are you going to jail?" Melissa asked with the directness that only children possessed. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe. But whatever happens, I want you to know that Daddy loves you more than anything in the whole world, and I'm sorry I've become someone you can't be proud of." The line went quiet for a long moment before Melissa's small voice delivered a blow more devastating than any legal consequence. "I don't think I want to visit you anymore, Daddy. You scare me now." After the call ended, Hutchinson sat in his living room as darkness fell around him, contemplating the loaded service weapon that represented 20 years of trying to be the kind of man his community could respect. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his career protecting people from threats, only to become the very danger he'd sworn to guard against. It was then that his ex-wife Linda appeared at his door, her face etched with concern that transcended their bitter divorce. She found him on the couch, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the weapon in his hands. "Billy," she said gently, moving slowly into the room. "Now put the gun down. Whatever you're thinking, this isn't the answer." "I hurt a child, Linda," he said, his voice breaking on words that carried the weight of irreversible damage. "A blind child who never did anything wrong. Her dog was protecting her, and I destroyed something beautiful because I was too drunk and angry and stupid to see what was really happening." Linda sat beside him on the couch, her hand covering his with the familiarity of 15 years of marriage. "You can't undo what happened, Billy, but you can choose what happens next. That little girl and her dog need you to be better than this moment, not worse." She gently took the weapon from his hands, setting it aside before wrapping her arms around the man she'd loved and lost to his own demons. "Melissa still needs her father," she whispered. "Not the man you've become, but the man you used to be. The one who joined the police force because he wanted to help people." At the veterinary clinic, Dr. Martinez worked through the night to stabilize Duke's condition, her team rotating in shifts to monitor his cardiac function and adjust medications. The German Shepherd drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to repair the damage while his spirit seemed to be searching for something, or someone, who wasn't there. "It's remarkable," Dr. Martinez told Dr. Pierce during one of their consultation calls. "His vitals improve slightly whenever we play recordings of the little girl's voice. I've seen this phenomenon before with service animals. They have such strong bonds with their handlers that separation can actually impede healing." "Gracie needs to see him," Dr. Pierce replied. "Or rather, she needs to touch him to know he's alive. They've been inseparable for 3 years. This separation is traumatizing them both." But the logistics were complicated by legal concerns. Duke was technically evidence in a criminal investigation, and Gracie was a victim whose medical care took priority over everything else. The bureaucracy that governed such situations seemed designed to keep them apart precisely when they needed each other most. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. District Attorney Sarah Chen, who had driven to Cedar Falls to assess the case personally, found herself moved by the story in ways that transcended legal precedent. A mother of 2 daughters herself, she understood that sometimes justice required flexibility rather than rigid adherence to procedure. "I'm authorizing supervised visitation," she announced to the assembled officials. That child and her service dog have a bond that's essential to both their recoveries. Keeping them separated serves no legal purpose and causes unnecessary suffering. The reunion took place at 3 in the morning in the hushed atmosphere of the veterinary clinic's intensive care unit. Gracie was wheeled in on a hospital bed, still connected to monitoring equipment but alert and determined. Duke lay on his side, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with the rhythm of medical intervention. but his ears perked up the moment he heard familiar footsteps. "Duke," Gracie whispered, her small hand finding his ear with the accuracy born of 3 years of perfect partnership. "I'm here, boy. I'm right here." The German shepherd's tail moved, just once, but enough to send ripples of hope through everyone present. His breathing seemed to steady as Gracie's fingers traced the familiar patterns of his fur, and the cardiac monitor showed the first normal rhythm he'd displayed since the incident. "That's my brave boy," Gracie continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You saved me again, didn't you? You always save me. But now I need you to save yourself, okay? I need you to get better so we can go home. Doctor." Martinez watched the monitors with amazement as Duke's vital signs continued to improve, his body responding to something beyond medical intervention. "Love," she murmured to Dr. Pierce. "It's the one medicine we can't prescribe, but sometimes it's the only one that works." As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, the community awakened to a changed world. The festival grounds stood empty except for the cleanup crews removing evidence of celebration turned nightmare, while Main Street buzzed with news crews and protesters demanding justice for Gracie and Duke. The story had become a symbol of larger issues: police accountability, disability rights, the sacred bond between humans and their service animals. But in the quiet of the veterinary clinic, none of that mattered. Only the sound of a little girl humming softly to her beloved companion, calling him back from the edge of darkness with the same unwavering devotion he had always shown her. The healing had begun, not just for Duke's damaged heart, but for a community that would have to reckon with how fear and prejudice had nearly destroyed the most innocent among them. Sheriff Billy Hutchinson faced charges that could end his career and possibly his freedom. But the real reckoning would come in learning to live with the knowledge of what his actions had cost. In attacking Duke and Gracie, he had revealed not just his own brokenness, but the fractures that ran through the heart of the community he'd sworn to protect. The road to redemption would be long and uncertain, paved with accountability and genuine change rather than easy forgiveness. But as Gracie's voice filled the clinic's intensive care unit with quiet songs of comfort, there remained hope that healing was possible, for Duke, for the community, and perhaps even for the man whose demons had led them all to this moment of truth. 1 month after the festival incident, Cedar Falls had settled into the uneasy rhythm of a community learning to heal from self-inflicted wounds. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Patterson farmhouse kitchen, where Dot carefully counted out Duke's cardiac medication while Gracie sat at the table reading a Braille book, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the raised dots. Duke lay beside her chair, his breathing steady and strong, though the white patch of fur on his chest, where the defibrillator paddles had burned him during his resuscitation, served as a permanent reminder of how close they'd come to losing each other. The letter from Dr. Martinez had arrived 3 days earlier, officially clearing Duke to resume his service duties. His heart had healed remarkably well, she'd written, though she recommended continued monitoring and a gradual return to full activity. More importantly, the psychological bond between Duke and Gracie had not only survived the trauma, but seemed to have deepened, their communication more intuitive than ever. "Grandma Dot," Gracie said, not looking up from her book. "Someone's coming up the driveway. Duke says it's not someone we know." Dot glanced out the window to see a modest sedan pulling up to their front porch, driven by a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes. The woman sat in her car for several moments, as if gathering courage, before finally stepping out and walking toward the house with the careful gait of someone carrying a heavy burden. The knock came softly, apologetically. Dot opened the door to find Linda Hutchinson standing on her porch, the ex-wife of the man who had shattered their peaceful world a month earlier. Linda's face showed the ravages of recent stress, sleepless nights, difficult conversations, the burden of loving someone who had become unrecognizable. Mrs. Patterson, Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm Linda Hutchinson, Billy's former wife. I wondered if I could speak with you for a few minutes. I understand if you don't want to see me. Dot studied the woman before her, seeing not the enemy she might have expected, but another soul carrying the weight of circumstances beyond her control. Come in, she said simply, stepping aside to allow Linda entry. Linda's eyes immediately found Gracie and Duke in the kitchen, the little girl continuing to read while the German shepherd maintained his vigilant position beside her chair. The sight seemed to affect Linda profoundly, her composure cracking as she witnessed the peaceful domesticity that her ex-husband's actions had nearly destroyed. I came to apologize, Linda said, accepting the cup of coffee Dot offered with shaking hands. I know it doesn't change anything, and I know it's not nearly enough, but I needed you to know that not everyone in Billy's family supports what he did, what he became. Gracie looked up from her book, her unseeing eyes turning toward the sound of Linda's voice with the precision that still amazed visitors. Are you the sheriff's wife? She asked, with the directness that only children possessed. Ex-wife, Linda corrected gently. We're divorced now. But yes, I was married to the man who hurt you and Duke. Why did he hurt us? Gracie asked, her small hands finding Duke's ears in the gesture that always comforted them both. We never did anything bad to him. Linda's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to find words that could explain the inexplicable to a 9-year-old. He was sick, sweetheart. Not sick in his body, but sick in his heart and his mind. Sometimes when people are very sad and angry for a long time, they start seeing danger where there isn't any. They start hurting people they should be protecting. Like when Duke had kennel cough and couldn't think straight? Gracie asked, her innocent comparison cutting to the heart of the matter with startling clarity. Yes, Linda whispered. Exactly like that. Dot watched this exchange with the wisdom of her 72 years, recognizing the genuine remorse in Linda's voice and the healing that sometimes came from unexpected encounters. Your husband, she said carefully, how is he managing? Linda's face crumpled. He's not. The state police arrested him 3 days after the incident. He's been charged with assault, excessive force, and endangering a child. His lawyer thinks he'll face at least 2 years in prison, maybe more with the federal civil rights charges they're considering. She paused, gathering herself before continuing. But the legal consequences aren't the worst part. Billy's always defined himself by his badge, by being someone people could depend on for protection. Now he's become the thing he spent his career fighting against. The guilt is eating him alive. Has he been drinking? Dot asked, though her tone carried understanding rather than judgment. More than ever. Some nights I get calls from the jail because he's asked them to contact me during his bad moments. He talks about Melissa, our daughter, and how she won't even take his phone calls anymore. 8 years old, and she's terrified of her own father because of what she saw on the news. Gracie set down her book and moved to the couch where Linda sat, Duke following with his careful, measured steps. The little girl reached out with the confidence of someone who navigated the world through touch, finding Linda's hand and covering it with her own small fingers. I forgive him, Gracie said simply, her words carrying a weight that seemed impossible from someone so young. Duke forgave him first. I could tell because his heart isn't angry anymore, and if Duke can forgive him, then I can too. Linda broke down completely then, tears streaming down her face as she gripped Gracie's hand like a lifeline. How can you forgive him? He could have killed you both. He did kill something, your sense of safety, your trust in the people who are supposed to protect you. Grandma Dot says holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick, Gracie replied, with the wisdom of someone who had learned early that bitterness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Besides, Duke is okay, and I'm okay, and sometimes people do terrible things when they're hurting inside. Dot felt her own eyes moisten as she watched her granddaughter offer grace to someone who had no right to expect it. The child who had faced blindness, the loss of her parents, poverty, and now assault with such remarkable resilience was teaching them all what true strength looked like. "There's something else," Linda said, wiping her eyes with the tissue Dot provided. "Billy wants to see you if you'll let him. Not to make excuses or ask for forgiveness he doesn't deserve, but to tell you something important, about why he was so afraid of Duke, and about his connection to your family." Dot and Gracie exchanged glances, or rather Dot looked at her granddaughter while Gracie tilted her head in the way that meant she was processing information that felt significant. "What kind of connection?" Dot asked carefully. Linda took a deep breath, as if preparing to share a secret that had been poisoning her marriage for years. "Billy never told you he was Gracie's father, did he?" The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything they thought they knew about the past month's events. Dot's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to shake, while Duke's ears perked up at the sudden tension in the room. "That's impossible," Dot whispered, though even as she spoke, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. "Gracie's father died before she was born. Sarah told me he was killed in Afghanistan." "Sarah lied," Linda said gently. "Billy told me the truth when we were dating. He'd gotten a young woman pregnant when he was 23, but when the doctors said the baby would be born blind, he panicked. He couldn't handle the idea of having a defective child, his words, not mine. So he walked away, left town, and let Sarah tell everyone he was dead." Gracie's small voice cut through the heavy silence. "You mean the man who hurt Duke is my daddy?" The question hung in the air, carrying with it implications that would reshape their understanding of everything that had happened, everything that was still to come, and the complex nature of human failure and redemption in a small Iowa town where nothing would ever be quite the same again. Dear friends, if you've followed Gracie and Duke's journey this far, you know that sometimes life's most beautiful moments emerge from our darkest hours. Like many of us who've reached our golden years, you've probably learned that family isn't always defined by blood, and that second chances can arrive when we least expect them. Gracie's story reminds us that even when we feel forgotten or overlooked, like Dot counting pennies at her kitchen table, love has a way of multiplying when we share it freely. Whether you're a grandparent raising grandchildren, someone who's felt the sting of broken trust, or anyone who's ever believed that your best days were behind you, remember this. Duke's heart literally restarted because someone still needed him. Your heart can restart too. The courage of a 9-year-old blind girl choosing forgiveness over bitterness shows us that it's never too late to heal old wounds and build the family we've always dreamed of. Sometimes the love we've been searching for has been waiting patiently right beside us all along. What moment in your own life taught you that love can overcome impossible odds? Have you ever experienced an unexpected family reunion or reconciliation that changed everything? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The revelation of Billy Hutchinson's true identity as Gracie's father transformed the Patterson farmhouse kitchen into a space where past and present collided with the force of long-buried truths finally surfacing. Dot gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white as she processed Linda's words, while Gracie sat perfectly still, her small hands resting on Duke's head as if drawing strength from his steady presence. "My daddy," Gracie whispered, testing the words like someone learning a new language. "The man who hurt Duke is really my daddy." Linda nodded, though she immediately realized the futility of the gesture when speaking to a blind child. "Yes, sweetheart." "Billy is your biological father, though he has no right to that title after what he's done." Dot's mind raced through memories of her daughter Sarah's pregnancy, the carefully constructed story about a soldier who'd died serving his country, the way Sarah had flinched whenever Dot asked for details about Gracie's father. The lies had been built on love, a mother's desperate attempt to protect her unborn child from the rejection that had already wounded them both. "Sarah never told me," Dot said, her voice carrying the weight of a grandmother who'd been denied the truth about her own granddaughter's parentage. "She let me believe Gracie's father was a hero who died for his country, not a coward who abandoned his child because she wasn't perfect enough for him." "Sarah was protecting Gracie," Linda replied gently, "and protecting you too, I think. Billy made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the baby, especially after the doctors confirmed the blindness. He actually suggested—" She paused, the words too cruel to speak aloud. "What?" Dot pressed, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "He suggested Sarah consider terminating the pregnancy. Said it would be kinder than bringing a disabled child into the world." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Duke's soft breathing and the ticking of Earl's old mantel clock. Gracie's face showed a maturity that seemed impossible for her 9 years, processing the knowledge that her father had wished she'd never been born. "Is that why he was so scared of Duke?" Gracie asked with the logical directness that often surprised adults. "Because Duke helps me be independent, and that means I'm not broken the way he thought I would be?" Linda stared at this remarkable child, understanding for the first time why Billy's guilt and self-hatred had manifested as hostility toward the dog that proved everything he'd believed about disability was wrong. Duke represented not just Gracie's independence, but Billy's fundamental failure as both a father and a human being. "I think," Linda said carefully, "that seeing you and Duke together reminded him of the choice he made 23 years ago. You're everything he told himself you could never be. Happy, capable, loved. Duke helps you navigate the world, but you were already navigating it beautifully before he came along." Dot rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone making a momentous decision. "I want to see him," she announced, surprising everyone, including herself. "I want to see Billy Hutchinson and hear from his own mouth why he abandoned his daughter and then tried to destroy the thing that gave her joy." "Grandma Dot," Gracie said, her voice filled with concern. "Are you sure? You don't have to put yourself through that." "Yes, I do," Dot replied firmly. "You've forgiven him, sweet girl, and that's a gift he doesn't deserve but desperately needs. But before this family can heal, I need to understand how a man can walk away from his own child and then spend 20 years punishing the world for his cowardice." The Cedar Falls County Jail was a modest building that reflected the town's typically low crime rate, though the past month had strained its resources with the media attention and security concerns surrounding Billy's case. Dot had called ahead, using the influence that came with being a 72-year-old widow whose granddaughter had become a national symbol of resilience and forgiveness. Billy appeared in the visitor's room looking like a man who'd aged a decade in 30 days. His uniform had been replaced by orange jail scrubs, his face was gaunt from poor sleep and irregular eating, and his hands shook slightly as he sat across from Dot at the scarred metal table. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why you came, but thank you for giving me the chance to—" "Stop!" Dot interrupted, her tone carrying the authority of someone who'd raised children and buried loved ones and had no patience for empty words. "I didn't come here for your apologies, Billy Hutchinson. I came here for answers." Billy's eyes filled with tears as he met her gaze for the first time. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know how a man abandons his pregnant girlfriend because their baby might be born different. I want to know how that same man becomes a police officer sworn to protect the vulnerable. And I want to know how he justifies spending 20 years hiding from his daughter before trying to destroy the one thing that gives her independence. The questions hit Billy like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the justifications he'd built around his choices. "I was 23 years old," he began weakly, then stopped as he realized how inadequate that sounded. "I was 22 when I married Earl," Dot replied sharply. 24 when Sarah was born with a hole in her heart that required 3 surgeries before she was 5. Age doesn't excuse cowardice, Billy. Fear doesn't justify abandonment. Billy's composure cracked completely, 20 years of suppressed guilt pouring out in ugly sobs that echoed off the cinder block walls. "I was terrified," he admitted. "My own father was an alcoholic who beat me for being too slow, too stupid, too much trouble. When the doctor said Gracie would be blind, all I could think about was how my father would have reacted to a disabled child. I couldn't imagine being a father to someone who needed more than I thought I could give." "So you became exactly like your father," Dot observed with devastating accuracy. "A man who hurts children instead of protecting them." "Yes," Billy whispered. "I became everything I swore I'd never be." And when I saw Gracie with Duke so confident and happy and independent, I realized that she'd grown up to be everything beautiful I'd thrown away. Duke represented what I'd refused to believe was possible, that she could have a full, rich life despite her blindness. Dot studied the broken man across from her, seeing not the monster who'd attacked her granddaughter, but the damaged child who'd never learned how to love unconditionally. "Gracie forgives you," she said finally. "God knows why, but she does. The question is whether you can forgive yourself enough to become the father she deserves now, instead of the coward you were then." Billy looked up with something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. "Is that possible? After everything I've done?" "That," Dot replied, standing to leave, "depends entirely on whether you're finally ready to be the man Gracie needed you to be 23 years ago. It's never too late to start being a real father, Billy." "But it starts with accepting that love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard." As she walked away, leaving Billy alone with his choices and their consequences, Dot felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't expected to feel toward her granddaughter's father. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility that healing might be achievable for them all.